Welcome again to another video of One Identity Manager Basics. We talk about One Identity Manager installation, and in this specific video, which is part 2 of the installation series, we will talk about One Identity Manager services and how to install them. Remember, what we have right now is an installed database. We have an admin workstation with client tools installed, and a first service was installed as well on our database server, just as part of the initial installation. And you can remember it was the service that was using the database as a target system. Now we want to connect a specific target system. We will connect an Active Directory, and therefore we need another service which is as well remotely to install. Let's have fun with that, and let's start with that. As you can see, open on the screen, there is the login screen for Launchpad. This is the tool I typically start if I want to start other tools. I need to sign in. And the first thing to see is that under the overview screen, there are a lot of yellow exclamation marks here. This is a sign that I can a lot of things more configure than I have configured right now. I only want to show you how that typically works. There is the automatic software update, for example. This is the ability of the Identity Manager just for all client workstations. That means for all admin workstations to automatically upgrade, control, and update software. It's a security feature in the same way than a deployment feature. Deployment, it's clear. You can install newer software versions or newer DLLs or hotfixes easily because each front end is doing that on its own. The second feature is a security feature. If people try to change binaries underneath, they get automatically rechanged because the software update automatically corrects them. To activate that feature, I can hit the run button, as you can see, and front end will be started. That specific front end is named Designer in that very specific case. It is the main configuration front end of the Identity Manager. And important is that it jumps directly into the deep of that front end. You can see I'm in the configuration parameter section. Wherever I am, automatically pre-selected is auto update. That is exactly the feature I want to turn on. I can directly do that. I hit the button there. I have to check here the round boxes. There's no check in there. With that, I don't need a database compilation. It is enough just to store my changes to the database. Here we are. I close my Designer, I close my Launchpad, and I start my Launchpad again. And with just signing in, automatically I can see here this is checked. Depending on how often that happens and which configuration exists, it could be that an auto update runs in between. That means the system updates between the start of the Launchpad and open the Launchpad. But what you can see here is that this is now a green check mark, and I can go to the next step. For example, join to One Identity Installing if I like to do that. This is how to work with Launchpad and the installation options. What I now like to do is to install a second server service. Remember, during the first video, that means during the database installation, we installed our first server service on the database server, and I told it is pretty uncommon in a production environment. It is more common in a demo environment to install on such a server and service. So, however, what I like to do here is just to start another installation. I can do it directly from here. Here's One Identity Manager service for the database, but I can as well see that as services at all. If I hit the run button, then automatically my server installer starts, and the server installer is not really a server installer, it is a server service installer. With next, I have to connect to the database. There is only one. I have to connect with a system user. I created one during the installation, and the password is already pre-configured because I'm starting from the Launchpad, and Launchpad knows about it. I click on Next, and now the first important screen exists. As you can see, right now, server service properties on IMSO2. There is already a server service available, and that's the reason why that server service is here, or that server is here configured in that drop-down box, because it's the only server the database knows about. What I have to do is I have to add one. And adding one, I can just type in another name. So I will take IMSO3. And doing so and stepping to the queue field, automatically the queue name will be generated. What the hell? It's a queue name. Let me say it that way. In the database, there are jobs, and these jobs get automatically assigned to server services, or they should be, because server services will precede these jobs. And to not assign all jobs to one poor server service, which then will automatically die because too much work to do, it is possible from a server function perspective to assign these specific jobs per function to specific queue names. So for example, if I want to synchronize my Active Directory, I name the queue name for my Active Directory like the Active Directory domain controller. In our case, IAMSO1, for example. In this specific case, I'm installing a server service on the server IMSO3, and so the queue name is per default IMSO3. Could be something other else as well. What happens now is the following. In the database, there's a, for example, Active Directory synchronization job assigned to IMSO1. That is just a convention. I can as well assign that to the name chocolate if I like to do. If this is the case, then on the server service side, I have as well to configure a queue which is named chocolate. It is a text comparison. That means if the text which is configured in the server service configuration is the same text then configured in the database, in the job queue, then these jobs can be executed by this specific service. In our case, server names, I have a queue that is called IMSO3, and I can as well enter the full qualified name of my server. And then I'm good. With next, this server gets just created in the database, and I can assign, first of all, the complete software I want to install. In my case, I need the job server. Later on, I want to use that service to remotely connect to my Active Directory and to do the Active Directory jobs. I need the configuration tools. This is on a server service configuration always a good idea. And I take as well the SCIM components. Maybe I need the SCIM components as well. With next, now I can select server functions. On the first screen, I was just deciding about binaries getting installed on my server. That means in the program files, one identity manager folder. Now I'm talking about which functionality the IMSO3 queue will or may have in the future. And therefore, I look here into that and decide, okay, Active Directory connector could be, because it is, the software was pre-selected. Active roles is like Active Directory, so that makes sense. CSV connector is nice. CSV script server, maybe, let's do it. Yeah, default report server, maybe, why not? Domain controller, of course not, because this machine is no domain controller. Generic database connector, maybe, so let's do it. Home server, it's a good idea. Maybe PowerShell connector is a good idea. And let me say it that way. Maybe the profile server is a good idea as well. And that should be good for now. What I did here is I configured that specific queue IMSO3 for all of these functions. That means in the identity manager, if I connect a target system or I just start a specific process for a specific purpose, which is here selected, then I can select the queue name or the server name of that specific IMSO3 as well, if I like to. So with next, I jump to the next screen, and what I see there is the server service configuration. Last screen, the configuration to assign jobs in the database to queue names. This screen is now the configuration of my server service, where I have, for example, to configure the queue, which is executing these jobs. You can see that directly here. There's the job destination. If I look into the job destination, then you can see a queue name IMSO3. It's configured. Not really wondering us, because that was what we configured 2 or 3 screens before. What I can here do as well is to configure that service, and that is what I like to talk now as well. There is, for example, the interval that this service uses to look into the database and search for jobs. It is in a production to 90 seconds. This is a perfect preset for a production environment. In a demo environment, that could be a little bit long, and so I configure the smallest amount I can configure in demo environments. For a production, this is not a good idea. For a demo environment with with only a few users and a few database connects, 30 seconds is possible. Every value lower than 30 seconds is even in a demo environment a really bad idea. To all the configuration which is here preset, I can say that typically this is a perfect preset for nearly all purposes, and you only should change these preset if you have really good reasons for. Yeah, this is based on a lot of experience people had with their job services and improved many times, and so the preset is perfect. And if you have specific needs, then you can just change that. Back to the queues. This is now my queue AMSO3. Remember, I talked about Active Directory jobs should be executed by the domain controller IMSO1, which will happen remotely from IMSO3, but they will be assigned to IMSO1. Why? Because it is nice to see which are Active Directory sync jobs. And to do so, I need here something specific which is not configured, and that is a second queue. What's behind that? You have the chance at the end to address one target system per queue name to one server service. So this server service is looking for IMSO3 jobs and whatever else IMSO3 in the database is representing, for example, an LDAP. Now you get additionally an Active Directory, which is represented by IMSO1. Why? Because that's a convention and IMSO1 is my domain controller. So I need as well a queue name and a queue for IMSO1 jobs. In this example, it could make sense in this service to create another queue. How this is done? Perfectly easy. I step here in job destination. I click on insert. And I add another job service destination. Here we are. And with that, I can now rename the whole thing a little bit, that it makes a little bit more sense. And the only thing I have to do in that new queue, I have to enter here the new queue name, which is. And if I like to, I can as well put that queue into the demo mode. And with that, I have now two queues configured, which means exactly that this service will automatically execute all jobs for IMSO1 and IMSO3. I can add as well more queues if I like to. The perfect match is one queue per service, but if you want to connect more than 350 target systems, and that is not very seldom, then 350 server services makes 100% no sense, especially if they are installed on different machines, because that means 350 VMs, for example. Because of that, more than one queue per service is good. Typically, I like to say in production environments, target systems with a big change ratio, that means with thousands of changes a day, will get their own queue, and target systems which have only a few of changes, for example 150 changes a day or so, will then be together with another target system queue on the same server service. What I not talked about right now is to have more than one service on the same machine installed. Why is that more uncommon? Yeah, because of the resources. Typically, server services eats resources, and if you have more than one server service installed, that means 2, 3, or 4, then you have to have as well enough resources available in hard disk space, but mainly in RAM and CPU power, which all of these server services can use in parallel. What's the difference? More services means all queues gets activated in parallel. More queues in one service means they get activated round robin. That means I start with the IMSO1 queue, do some jobs there, then I jump to the IMSO3 queue, do some jobs there, and I return to the IMSO1 key. This is what round robin says, and this is what happens if you have more queues in one service. If you have more services in parallel, they can act in parallel on the same database, which is a more uncommon scenario. The only common scenario for things like that is to have more services on one machine, but these services are just being connected to different target systems. That means to different identity manager installations. Typical identity manager environment does have 3 databases. One as a developer database, one as a quality assurance database, and one as a production database. And all of them have their own services. And in this case, you can have, for example, a server which holds 3 services, one connected to test, one connected to quality assurance, and one connected to production. This is a more typical scenario, let me say it that way. But it is more typical. If you want to do that, no problem at all. There's a service server installer as a command line based version, and with that you can as well determine different services name and such. And it is as well possible with, if you use the remote GUIs, with the advanced options to determine specific service names. So all it's possible, but at the end, again, this scenario is more uncommon. Very common are more queues. That is the reason why I configured that here. More configuration to talk about. First of all, here underneath of process collection, there is the database connector just configured. You get your jobs out of the database. If I will hit here on connection string and edit, then you will see all the ways, all the configuration I need to access my database. I jump out with cancel because without that I have to enter a new password. Configuration might be of interest. A good thing, for example, is the component debug mode. That is good if you start your environment and you want to ensure that everything works well because you get more log level. On the other hand side, if it's a production environment, that's a little bit too much. More of interest, HTTP server port. Automatically, you saw that in video 1. It is possible in the Identity Manager to access these services or the HTTP server of these services per web browser. To do so, you have to use port 1880, which is the default port. If you need something different, for example 9999, then you can enter that directly here. There are customers outside, let me say it that way, they have different ports per server. You can do that, but honestly, that will make my brain to explode. So, let's go to the log writer. Here is the log writer. Log writers are important. This is the text log writer, per default configured, and per default it just writes the log to %temp and then jobservice.log. If you want to have it somewhere different, for example in C logs, one identity, then server logs, then you can do that. But at present I'm using this. This is the default and I'm fine. You can as well configure a little bit more. For example, you can configure here the maximum size of these logs. 3 megabytes are good because we want to see them in browsers. You can as well just configure the number of logs. 28 are a lot of logs. Yeah? And you can as well configure the rotation. That means when the first gets at the end rotated, or you can as well configure when the log automatically gets rotated to the next log, for example, each night at 24 p.m. So we will jump over dispatcher and connection. Many more options there. Please look into the manual if you are interested to change something. I personally suggest use the default. HTTP authentication might be of interest as well. You saw it is possible just with the browser to access these specific server logs. For people who don't want to have that, it is possible as well to add security. For example, you can enter here a specific group name or enter an Active Directory group name there, and only members from these Active Directory groups will then be able to access this specific browser front. With plugins, you can extend the functionality of this server service. A pretty common plugin is the performance counter plugin that allows your system monitoring tools to see a lot of more performance counters. That might always be a good idea. There are some other plugins available as well. Please look into the manual. With that, I like to end that session here and says this job service is perfectly configured. I have a look at my queue time here in both queues. That looks good. And with next, I just jump then to the screen that says, do you want to install this server service now? Yes, of course. I like to install that server service. The source is already checked in green. And with next, I have to talk about which service or which account to use to register my service on IMSO3. As you know, standardly services will be registered as local system, and local system is helpful on one specific server, but it is painful if you want to access the network. Reason for that is local system does have only local system permissions, but no network permissions. Our services often acts grabbing data from whatever else parts of the network, acting as network users, and so they need their own Windows user. In my very specific case, there's a predefined user. It's a service account, of course, and this specific service account does have permissions in the network. So I configured just this. Which permissions these services or these accounts should have is depending on what the server service should do with other machines. So it is different from service to service, or it could be different from service to service, and of course it could be different from customer to customer. I need as well to configure the password. And once the password is confirmed, I have the ability as well to hit here on click to see additional settings. These additional settings are an additional set of access settings, because there is a capability that some people says my server service does have a specific account with less privileges, but with all the privileges you need in the network. But to install this server service on the machine, I need a more admin account. And so it's possible here to configure this account that allows me to install that service on the machine. In my demo environment, I keep it simple. And so I can use the same account I have here for the installation as for the server's registration. And with next, as you can see, the installation starts. What happens now? All the binaries gets copied remotely to the server, and the server service gets registered in this IMSO3 server. Excellent. This server service is already installed. I can click next. Server service installation is complete. I click finish, and now I want to see and test my server service. Therefore, I click on Manage. Remember, we have job queue info. I check the system status, of course. It gets automatically started. And if it is started, I can have a look into the job service role. There is only one server available. I can hit the refresh button here. As you can see, directly another server service. It is on IMSO3 installed. And if I right-click the right machine and says Show in Browser, then I see here two things. First of all, I see here two queues. There is one queue for IMSO1 and one queue for IMSO3 installed. And if I step to the log, I see that message as well, two queues again, and I see my first jobs. And because they are looking green, this is a good sign and says this server service is working. The first thing, by the way, what your server service is doing, an auto update, because we configured the auto update before. With that, the first part is done. I have another job service right now installed on IMSO3, and the next step will be to upgrade my database in a way that an Active Directory can be synchronized. In the next scenario of my demo, I like to show you how to connect Active Directory. And before we can start with connecting to Active Directory, we should talk a little bit about the Identity Manager and identities. If I connect to Active Directory, I can read out, of course, domains, containers, accounts, groups, and such objects, machines, of course, as well. All of these objects are Active Directory objects, but to be something sensible in an identity and access management system, that means in our Identity Manager, I have to ensure that these accounts I will read out are as well assigned to identities. And therefore, I need identities. Identities typically will be delivered by an HR system, which is often the authoritative source for an identity and access governance system. And to get these identities, of course, I need another import. For example, an import to SAP HR or to PeopleSoft or whatever else other system. Because I don't want to configure that as well, this will make my video a little bit longer than necessary. I will now use a trick which exists and is very helpful in demo scenarios. And that is to create identities from my Active Directory accounts. The benefit is I just connect my Active Directory and read out all of these objects, and with each account, automatically an identity gets created. This is of course not a production scenario, but it is a very helpful demo scenario. To do so, I need a specific configuration, which is typically set per default if you install the Identity Manager per default. But because it is important, I show you the configuration just here at the begin as a prerequisite. To do so, what I need is my configuration tool. Therefore, I step to tools, and in tools, there is, for example, the designer. You know, designer is my configuration and customization frontend. Starting with the designer, directly on the first page, there is edit configuration parameters. I hit on that. I get the configuration parameter section. We saw them before, just jumped into the deep. There are more of them. I want to talk about target system connects. So target system, it's a good choice. I step into target systems. There's Active Directory, of course. And here I can find the parameter to talk to. It is the parameter that is named person auto full sync. And meant is what happens if there is an account from Active Directory inserted in the database and no identity exists. As you can see, the configuration for that pre-configured parameter here is set to search and create. And the behavior is that if a new Active Directory account gets inserted and a script is not able to assign that Active Directory account to an existing identity based on some criteria, then it will automatically create a new one. And that means person auto full sync needs to be configured to search and create. And this is the preset you need to connect your Active Directory and get identities as well. Again, this is a demo scenario and of course nothing for production use, but it could be helpful for the demo or for a first creation of identities, for example, even in production environments. So having that said, I just let the configuration as it is and go back to my Launchpad. In the Launchpad, in the installation overview, if I go a little bit down below, there should be something like connect to the target system. And there it is, target system type Active Directory. That is exactly what we want to connect. To do so, I have to hit on run. And then another tool starts, and that other tool is the synchronization editor. This is the tool I use to manage all of my synchronization projects. You see pre-configured comes up here the configuration of an Active Directory connection. And I have now the choice if I want to use the native Identity Manager Active Directory connector or if I want to use a maybe existing Active Roles connector for my connection. I will, of course, use Active Directory Direct Connector because this is nothing that needs Active Roles installed underneath before I can start with. And with Next, I'm on the next screen. And here I can determine if I want to configure this connection from this admin workstation or if I want to do that from a remote server. Why this is an option? Remote servers could be helpful if you deal with target systems which needs a specific set of DLLs, for example SAP or Notes or something else. These needs specific DLLs and they are typically not installed on an admin workstation, and so I can use a server that holds these DLLs for the remote connection. Therefore, on these servers, a server service needs to be installed. Now I will let it as it is. I will just click on Next. And I see my Active Directory domain, which is pre-configured. Of course, if you have more than one Active Directory, there will be more in the drop-down box. And of course, it is possible, depending on the configuration of your domain, that the one or the other is not really seeable. And then you should just here enter an other string. I am happy with my pre-selection because I already have only this domain. With Next, I can now determine the user I need to access my Active Directory. Again, Active Directory is a target system. I want to access it. That means I want to write into the Active Directory. I want to read from the Active Directory. To do so, I need an account that allows to do something like this. In my environment, this is in this specific domain, an account that is called svc_1im_AD. And of course, there's a password available. And this is the domain, of course. And if I here hit the test button and the return, it's a green check here, you can see that, then this Active Directory was correctly accessed. That means everything is nice. I just click on Next. And I have to determine the server bindings. Secure binding is a good idea. A server binding additionally is as well a good idea for my domain controller. There is a domain controller already determined that it comes from Active Directory. Active Directory knows which is the only Active Directory domain controller in my specific environment. If there are more than one, you will find them here in the drop-down box. The port is the standard Active Directory port. Here we are. And again, the test says with these configurations, you can wonderfully connect to your Active Directory. With Next, I can now just determine some of the basic settings. This is depending on which features are installed in my Active Directory. Here I can restore objects for the recycle bin. A specific configuration is needed in Active Directory to support that. To allow to deal with remote access service properties is something that needs RAS properties installed. And at the end, to allow a read-write access to terminal service properties is something which is automatically checked because that is what every Active Directory can do. With that, I click here on Finish, and the first step is done. That means the connection to Active Directory is configured. Now I need the other side of the connection, and the other side of the connection is the Identity Manager connection. Here you can see pre-configured the SQL Server user I use to access my database typically, but there is no password. I have to enter that. The reason for is that the system don't know which account be taken, and with that it don't know which password to be used. Database is pre-selected, that's perfect. And next. Now the complete Active Directory synchronization project gets created. Once that project is created, I get the green check and can step with the next button to my next screen and can select which type of synchronization it should be. A read-only synchronization, that is only good if I only want to get the data. Typically for Active Directory and other systems, a read-write connection is what I need. And last but not least, I have to determine the queue which is be used just to assign these Active Directory synchronization jobs to. Remember our speech on queues? We created a queue IMSO1, which is the name of my domain controller before, and this is exactly what we want to select. With that, I can just step next and finish. And of course, I need that checkbox here that says activate that synchronization project before it can be used. Excellent. Last thing that is back is to talk about database encryption. Even the synchronization editor let me know that at present the database is not encrypted. That is good with me, and so I click on yes. And I'm done. Last step to do is to talk a little bit about the synchronization project. As you easily can see, this is what is right now selected. You can directly connect it or load it from the list if you want to. Here it is. And it is connected to my Active Directory. I don't want to talk about too many features of the synchronization editor, but I have now the choice to synchronize directly the Active Directory into my database because right now I only created the project. The project itself contains things like process steps, that means in which order Active Directory objects get synchronized. It contains as well property matchings and mappings and all of these things to be able later on a second try to identify the same objects on both sides of the synchronization. What I like to do here is a little bit configuration, which is good for the first run. I step therefore to the Identity Manager connection first and just click here on Setup. And if I do so, I can activate a creation of synchronization logs, which is at the begin always a good idea. For a production environment, not too much, because if I do that, then I will have a lot of text information gets stored. But in an additional or in an initial case, it is always good to have all log messages available, which are available. So here we are, Identity Manager connection, all logs available. The same thing will happen on the target system side. That means on the Active Directory side, I can click here on Setup as well. And I can here as well configure all the log options which are available. Here we are. If I'm able to see my Active Directory, I can as well hit here on the browser button and then I can look into my Active Directory. This is a real-time view of my Active Directory. For example, I can look into my domain DNS. For example, there's just one entry. Here we are, but it is directly queried out of the Active Directory. Or I can look into the users. And here are my users. You can see 2047 users, and here are the properties of one of them. At the end, this browser is something like the users and computers front end from Microsoft, just implemented in the Identity Manager. I close that here and step from the configuration of my both target system sites to the startup configuration. This is what I will use when I want to start that synchronization project. Before I start it, I should hit on commit to database just to get my changes committed. Remember the log options. And having that done, I see my initial synchronization project. This is a startup configuration. You can create more than one of these configurations. Typically, they contains the project that gets started and a schedule assigned. And that is what these startup configuration mainly are doing. On the right hand side, you can see two buttons. There is simulate and run. Run, it's clear what it is. Simulate gives me back a report that says what will happen if I run that synchronization project. So let's have a look at that first. This is always a good test as well. System let me know that simulation typically takes a lot of resources and time. And several seconds later, with these very huge log options, I get a very huge report. You can see that 8,074 pages. This is because on a property basis, I get informed what that Active Directory synchronization will do. To show that, I just jump somewhere into the report. You can see here Active Directory accounts gets inserted with the following properties and so on. This is extremely detailed. I can as well jump directly to the end of the report. And there I can see a summary, and that summary says I will insert 1,039 Active Directory accounts, contacts, containers, domains, and so on, all of these different objects, all the properties and all of that things. This amount of detail is overwhelming, of course, and it is only because I just used the log option for just showing everything on both sides of the connection, and combined with that, I'm doing an initial synchronization where every object is new in the database. Closing that report, I will now start the synchronization. Therefore, I hit the run button already there. And if that run button is started, then it asks me if I want to synchronize my Active Directory using this synchronization editor or using a server service. And of course, I want to use the server service I've installed. So I click here on yes. The project is already started, and I can jump into my job queue info and can see directly in my job queue there is a synchronization project. It is already started and is processing, which means now my Active Directory gets inserted into the Identity Manager. To see that from a job service side, what I can do there is I can directly start into the job queue progress. Here I see then some jobs right now, not too much because it's only one small process that is working. But I can as well jump into the job service state, and I know that my job service who is just doing the job is IMSO3. And so I can just refresh the list to see my IMSO1 queue as well. I can use IMSO3 or 1 just to show in browser because it is physically the same machine. If I see here my queue, I can just select the queue which is responsible for IMSO1 jobs. Remember, in the job queue, you see as queue name IMSO1 configured. So I have to look into the queue of IMSO1 jobs. If I do so, I can see there is one slot just doing all the synchronization. It's just in step 6 of 24 and 5,120 objects of 5,220 12 objects are just working here. I can see as well what that process step is doing. It's a full sync. But however, this is one way to see it. The second way is to look into the log file. In the log file, very down to the button, I will as well see the synchronization. Here we are. This is my synchronization job. It's QIMSO1, as you can see. It's a full sync. That means a full projection. And it is just working there. And with F5, I can always get something more. Better here from my perspective is the overview from the home side. So back to the home side. In the meantime, step 10 of 23. And with refresh here or F5, you will get always a new message. 14, step 16, and we are fastly seeing the end of our synchronization. And then the slot is empty, which is then the sign all the jobs of this synchronization projects are done. I step back to my job queue info. I can see that this process disappeared. Now a lot of other processes are appearing. These are the post-synchronization processes, which happens for Active Directory as well. One of these process steps, by the way, is then creating missing identities. We will see here much more jobs in a short amount of time. But we can as well see that the full synchronization was done. Now post-sync jobs are just getting started, and more creation jobs for identities gets generated. What you can see as well is that all of these generated jobs are targeted to the queue of IMS02, which is our service that takes care for the database as a target system. And now nearly everything is done. This queue is already empty. I have a look into the DB queue. There are some calculation jobs left. These calculation jobs have to be done by the DB queue processor. The DB queue processor is the calculation head of the identity manager. What's getting here calculated is stuff like all the group assignments and all the stuff around of these things. This needs to happen during each synchronization. And as you easily can see, the system is quite fast and accesses these jobs step by step pretty fastly. And now both queues are empty. That means the DB queue is empty, the job queue is empty, and it's time for us to see what we got. Therefore, I step back to Launchpad, I step to Manage, and I open the display and maintain of content data, which starts my manager. The manager is my main data administration front end for data administrators. And if I look into the manager, I can directly jump to my Active Directory. Here is my Active Directory. If I open the hierarchical view in my new database, I can see my domain and a lot of containers, of course. For example, there is my company structure with all the sub-containers, as you can see there, a lot of UUs. I can as well just close that and jump, if I want to do that, into the users section of my Active Directory. Here we are. And as you can easily see, if I extend that a little bit, that I do have 1,039 Active Directory accounts available. I have round about 5,000 groups. Here we are, 5,212. And if I then, for example, select one of these specific users, I get the overview page, which is typical for the identity manager. Here we are. And you can see that as well to this very specific Active Directory account, beside all the groups assigned, it's an employee assigned, and the employee is the identity object. And if I just click on this employee object, the tool jumps automatically to the identity objects, and here is the identity objects in the center. You see the assigned Active Directory account. That gives me the good sign that in the identity manager we have now a couple of identities. So I just select two employees, which are my identities. I select the employee filter, and you see here a lot of identities, 1,068 identities created from my Active Directory account. With that, I have my first Active Directory connected. I synchronized all the data from Active Directory into my Identity Manager, and I can now play with.